All right, so get this. You want to know about peak performance, right?
Yeah.
But not just any peak performance. We're talking about the system that train Olympic champions, right?
Mm-hmm.
The Soviets, they were incredibly successful, especially in the 70s and 80s, and a lot of their, well, it came from sports psychology.
Yeah.
We're going to dive into Red Gold by Grigori Raiport.
Okay.
He was a sports psychologist for the USSR Olympic team back in the day.
Oh.
And their methods were so effective, they were even applied to their military and space program. So, it's serious stuff.
Wow. That's fascinating.
So to help us break down the system, we have an expert with us.
Happy to be here.
And you might be thinking, Soviet Union Olympics, what does this have to do with me?
Right.
Well, their approach, it wasn't just about building athletes. It was about building personalities, creating winners.
Yeah.
And that's something we can all learn from, right?
Absolutely.
So,
The Soviets believed that everyone has this incredible potential.
yeah.
But the first hurdle is overcoming our natural resistance to change. They call this homeostasis.
Yeah.
You can think of it as your body's desire to just keep things as they are, like a thermostat, trying to maintain a steady temperature.
But isn't some resistance to change? I mean, if we were constantly changing, wouldn't that be chaotic?
That's a great question.
How did the Soviets know when to push for change and when to stay put?
Well, the Soviets believe that change happens when the push for change is stronger than our resistance to it.
Sure.
They even had an equation for it.
Oh, wow.
The strength of the stimulus for change divided by the strength of our resistance equals the amount of change that will occur.
Okay.
They illustrate this with the story of Yosef, a boxer who experienced a crushing defeat.
Oh, yeah, the one who got absolutely pummeled. It made
Yeah.
him completely rethink his whole approach to boxing.
Right. It forced him to change. And ultimately, that change led him to become a champion.
Wow.
So the question is, what are the strong stimuli as our own lives?
Yeah.
What are the things that can shake us up and push us towards positive change?
Well, the book actually gives some pretty practical advice for figuring that out.
Oh, that's great.
First, it says you have to define your present self, who you are right now,
Okay.
and then your target self, who you want to become.
Mm-hmm.
But then it gets a bit more challenging, doesn't it?
Yes. The book encourages us to identify those less than desirable qualities we want to shed and visualize the qualities we want to cultivate.
Right.
It's about being honest with ourselves, even if it's uncomfortable,
Yeah.
and then picking a specific date to start almost like a commitment to this transformation.
That's interesting. They emphasize practicing these desired qualities almost like rehearsing for real life situations.
Yes.
So it's not just about thinking about change, it's about actively working towards it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that brings us to another key Soviet principle, their view of pain.
Okay.
They didn't shy away from it. In fact, they saw it as a crucial tool for growth.
That's definitely different from the avoid pain at all costs mentality we often see today.
Right.
Why did the Soviets have such a different perspective?
Well, they called our tendency to avoid pain dolorophobia, fear of pain.
Dolorophobia.
They argued that by constantly dodging discomfort, we actually weaken ourselves. They identified three main functions of pain.
Okay.
Firstly, it tells us something is wrong.
Okay.
Secondly, it motivates us to fix the problem.
Right.
And finally, pushing through pain leads to growth and a higher level of functioning.
They even had examples of families who intentionally raised their children with a high pain tolerance.
They did.
Like the Nikitin family who had their kids running barefoot in the snow and swimming in freezing water.
The Nikitins believed that by gradually increasing their children's threshold of pain, they were building resilience, both physically and mentally.
Wow.
And these kids actually showed advanced development compared to their peers.
So we all have a threshold of pain, but by becoming aware of it, maybe we can start to push past those limits.
Absolutely.
The book gives an example of Lala, a marathon runner whose performance was all over the place.
Yes. Alla, her coach, noticed a link between her emotional outbursts and her inconsistent running.
Interesting.
It turned out that her emotional state was directly impacting her ability to push through pain during races.
So by understanding her personal threshold of pain and learning to manage her emotions, she was able to improve significantly.
Yes.
That makes a lot of sense, but where do we go from here? How does all of this tie into achieving peak performance?
That leads us to the next level, mastering consciousness and attention.
Okay.
The Soviets believed that if you could control your attention, you could control your destiny.
Okay, that sounds really profound, but how did they actually apply that idea? Did they have any practical techniques for controlling your attention?
They used a simple example to explain how our perception shapes our consciousness.
Okay.
Imagine three friends see a man lose his hat in the wind. One laughs, Another feels bad for him, and the third is simply bored.
Okay.
Same event, 3 different perceptions, 3 different states of consciousness.
It shows how subjective our experiences can be. But how can we change our perceptions if they're so automatic?
The Soviets believed that by choosing how we perceive a situation, we can change how it affects us.
Okay.
Take Irina V., a runner, crippled by her fear of failure.
Oh, it's the one who was so worried about disappointing everyone that it was affecting her performance.
Yeah.
So how did they help her shift her perspective? Did they just tell her to think positive?
Her sports psychologist had her imagine her loved ones at the finish line, excited to see her, regardless of the outcome.
Okay.
He told her to run towards that feeling, not away from the fear. It was about choosing where to focus her attention.
And it worked just by changing her focus.
It did. Her anxiety decreased, her performance improved, and she started winning races.
Wow.
This really highlights the power of consciously directing our attention and choosing how we perceive the world around us. And speaking of directing attention, this is where the Soviets got really into concentration.
Right, they were obsessed with concentration. They even had an equation for it, didn't they? Something about concentration and pleasure?
Yes, they believe that the more concentrated your attention is, the more pleasure you experience.
Okay.
They argue that when we're truly present and engaged in something, we experience it more deeply and enjoy it more.
They used the example of eating an apple without paying attention.
Right.
You might finish the whole thing and not even realize it because you're distracted.
Exactly. The Soviets believed that when we're unfocused, we miss out on the richness of life. They had a lot of different exercises to train their athletes to develop laser-like focus.
Like switching back and forth between 2 radios, playing different things, or reading while listening to the news.
Yes.
Those sound incredibly challenging. What was the point of those exercises?
The point was to train the mind to block out distractions and consciously direct attention where you want it to go. They also had exercises for strengthening concentration by focusing on a single point, like the second hand of a watch.
So it wasn't just about multitasking, it was about being able to hold your attention on one thing for an extended period of time. What other techniques did they use?
They had athletes practice creating and manipulating mental images. They'd start with a simple object like a paperclip and study it in detail, and they'd close their eyes and try to recreate that image in their mind. And they would practice manipulating that image, rotating it, zooming in and out, adding details.
That's fascinating. It's like weightlifting for your mind. But they also believed you could use this focus to influence your body, right? Not just your mind.
That's right. They would have athletes focus their attention on specific body parts and try to create physical sensations like warmth or tingling. They believed this would help them develop a deeper mind-body connection and more control over their physical responses.
It sounds like they were really pushing the boundaries of what we think is possible with the mind, but we've only just begun to explore this system. Where do we go from here? What's the next layer of this Soviet peak performance onion?
Well, after mastering consciousness and attention, the Soviets emphasized self-control.
Okay.
They believed it was the defining characteristic of successful people no matter what field they were in.
Self-control, that's a big one. What exactly did they mean by that? Was it about being disciplined and denying yourself pleasure all the time?
It was more about mastering your impulses, physical, mental, and emotional.
Yeah.
It was about delaying gratification, resisting temptation, and persevering through challenges. They actually conducted a study on successful people from all walks of life.
And they found that most of them didn't have super high IQs or anything, right? It was their self-control that set them apart.
Exactly. And they saw a lack of self-control as the root of a lot of problems.
Yeah.
Procrastination, overeating, anxiety, even addiction.
Wow.
They came up with this model to explain the internal struggle we all face. They called it the Bruton-Supron model.
Okay, Bruton Supron.
Bruton is like the impulsive, pleasure-seeking part of ourselves, the one who wants that extra slice of cake.
Oh, so Bruton's a bad guy.
Well, not necessarily. It's just our primal instincts.
Okay.
And the Supron is our conscious, rational self, the one that knows we should probably skip the cake.
So Supron's the good guy.
Again, it's not about good or bad. It's about balance. They use the analogy of a rider and a horse.
With the Supron being the rider and the Bruton being the horse.
Exactly. And self-control is about training the rider to control the horse. I remember they had that story of Tara, the Olympic swimmer, who was battling chocolate cravings.
Oh, yeah, terror.
Knew she needed to lose weight. But those cravings were tough. Bruton was demanding instant gratification while her Supron was trying to stay focused on her long-term goals.
They had her separate herself from the cravings, right? Like viewing her body's impulses as something separate from her true self.
That's right. They said our bodies driven by instinct are actually pretty dumb. and can lead us astray. It's the supron, our conscious mind, that needs to step in and take control.
So how did they help Tamara strengthen her supron and resist those cravings? Did they just tell her to use willpower?
They had her create a reward system. If she resisted her cravings for a week and hit her weight loss goal, she could buy herself a new nightgown. But if she gave in, she had to spend that money on something she disliked, like cleaning supplies.
Oh, wow. So it was about creating positive reinforcement for the supron, and this actually helped her shift the balance of power between her Bruton and supron. It's interesting. They believe that practicing self-control in one area could actually boost your willpower in other areas as well.
That's right. They called it the ripple effect.
They even said that physical challenges, like enduring pain, could strengthen your self-control.
They did. They had this crazy device called the Silomer, which measured strength by having you endure electric shocks.
Wow, that's intense.
Talk about test of willpower.
But it shows how seriously they took this idea of pushing through discomfort to build mental toughness. But didn't they warn against taking self-control too far?
It did. They emphasized that too much self-control could stifle spontaneity and creativity.
Right.
They believed in balance, knowing when to exert self-control and when to let go and enjoy yourself. It's about finding that sweet spot where you can harness your willpower without losing your sense of self.
So it's not about becoming a robot, it's about being able to consciously choose when to be disciplined and when to let loose. That's fascinating. So we've talked about overcoming resistance to change, embracing pain, mastering consciousness and attention, and cultivating self-control. But where does this all lead? What's the ultimate goal of all this training?
The ultimate goal was to achieve a state of optimal functioning, or SOF, where individuals perform at their absolute best, almost effortlessly.
Yes.
It's like those moments when athletes describe being in the zone, but the Soviets didn't believe it was just some mystical experience. They thought it was something you could train for.
That's incredible. But before we dive into SOF, I think we need to give our listeners a moment to digest all of this incredible information. We'll be right back to explore the next level of this fascinating Soviet system. Welcome back. We've been exploring this incredible Soviet system for peak performance, and now we're about to dive into their concept of state of optimal functioning, or SOF for short.
SOF is that state where everything just clicks. You're performing at your absolute best effortlessly, with incredible precision. It's like athletes describe being in the zone, but the Soviets believed you could train for it.
So it wasn't just something that happened by chance.
No, not at all.
They actually broke it down and figured out the science behind it. What did they find?
They discovered that SOF has distinct characteristics, physical, emotional, and mental.
Okay, so like a holistic thing.
Exactly. Physically, athletes in SOF often report unusual bodily sensations. For instance, weightlifter Vasily Alexeyev felt a tingling in his jaw and dryness in his mouth right before a big lift.
Wow.
Others have described coolness at their temples or even tears in their eyes.
It's like their bodies are giving them these subtle cues, almost like a signal that they are entering this heightened state. Did they find that these physical signs were the same for all athletes, or do they vary depending on the person and the sport?
The signs varied quite a bit. Wrestlers often talk about feeling grounded and balanced.
Okay.
Basketball players sometimes subconsciously shuffle their feet when they're anxious before a free throw. The key is recognizing your own individual cues.
So it's about paying attention to those subtle signals from your body. I find it fascinating that they also talked about this feeling of merging with your equipment.
Yes, athletes in SOF often describe feeling like their equipment becomes an extension of themselves. Fencers talk about their foil becoming an extension of their arm. Musicians feel a seamless connection to their instrument. It's as if the boundaries between the athlete and their tool disappear.
They become this single, unified force. I've even heard athletes talk about feeling this sense of unity with their opponents.
That's right. Wrestler Anatoly Topalev talked about feeling so connected to his opponent that he could anticipate their every move, almost like they were extensions of his own body. That's a really advanced level of SOF. But SOF isn't just physical, it's also emotional.
So emotionally, what does SOF feel like? Is it always about feeling happy and pumped up?
Often, athletes in SOF report positive emotions like joy, exhilaration, even a sense of serenity, but it's not always about feeling good. Some athletes, like boxers, might tap into anger or even fear to fuel their performance.
So it's not about denying those emotions, it's about using them to your advantage.
Exactly. The key is finding that optimal level of emotional arousal. And the Soviets had a surprisingly simple tool for that.
Really?
Your pulse.
Okay, your pulse?
They believed your pulse directly reflected your level of anxiety athletes would track their pulse rate before and during competitions to find their optimal zone for peak performance.
So if your pulse is too low, you need to pump yourself up, and if it's too high, you need to calm down. Did they have specific techniques for regulating those emotional states?
They used a combination of physical and mental techniques.
Okay.
Physical exercises like jumping jacks or slow stretching could be used to adjust the pulse rate. They also used visualization and self-talk to influence emotional states.
Okay.
Sometimes they even used unconventional methods to get the desired response.
Yeah, what do you mean by unconventional methods? Like, what?
They told a story about Natasha, a biathlete who struggled with low arousal. Her coach noticed that she performed better when she was angry, so he would deliberately provoke her before competitions to get her fired up.
So sometimes a little bit of controlled anger can actually be helpful.
Exactly. It's about harnessing the power of your emotions, whatever they may be. So we've covered the physical and emotional components of SOF. But what about the mental side? What's happening in the mind of an athlete who's in this peak state?
That's what I'm really curious about. Is it like a state of total emptiness? Do they stop thinking altogether?
It's not about emptying the mind. It's about shifting your focus from the goal to the means.
Okay.
Instead of obsessing over winning athletes in SOF, become totally absorbed in the process, executing each step with incredible precision and mindfulness.
So it's like instead of focusing on finishing the marathon, you focus on your stride. You're breathing each step along the way. By mastering the process, you ultimately achieve the goal.
Exactly. They use the example of marathon runners.
Okay.
Experienced runners don't think about the finish line miles away. They are constantly monitoring their pace, their energy levels, and making adjustments as needed. They break the complex goal into smaller, more manageable steps.
But some athletes say they don't think about anything at all when they're performing at their best.
That's true.
It's like they're operating purely on instinct. How does that fit in with this idea of focusing on the process?
For some athletes, especially in sports that are very technical or fast-paced overthinking, can actually be detrimental.
Right.
In these cases, it's about trusting your training and letting go of conscious control. But that level of unconscious competence only comes from hours of deliberate practice. You have to train your skills to the point where they become second nature.
It's like the difference between thinking about every keystroke when you're first learning to type and then effortlessly flowing across the keyboard once you've mastered it. So basically, there are different mental approaches to achieving SOF, and the best approach depends on the individual and the task at hand.
Right. But regardless of the technique, the underlying principle is the same, achieving a state of focused attention and effortless execution.
So we've covered the physical, emotional, and mental characteristics of SOF, but how do we actually get there? What are the practical steps to unlock this peak performance state?
The Soviets developed a detailed training program called auto conditioning training, or ACT.
ACT.
It combines physical exercises, mental techniques, and some pretty unconventional tools to help individuals achieve SOF.
ACT. That sounds intriguing. Before we get into that, let's give our listeners a chance to process all this fascinating information about SOF. We'll be right back to explore the practical steps to achieving this elusive state of peak performance.
All right, we're back and ready to unpack this auto conditioning training program, or ACT. Sounds intense.
It might sound like something out of a science fiction movie.
Yeah.
But ACT is a systematic approach to training your mind and body for peak performance. The Soviets were all about taking a scientific approach, and they believed that achieving a state of optimal functioning, or SOF, it wasn't about luck or talent. It was a skill you could develop through consistent effort and practice, just like physical strength. So this ACT program was their secret weapon for developing those skills.
You could say that it combined physical exercises, mental techniques, and even some unusual tools to help you tap into your full potential. One of the first steps is creating something called Ganzfeld goggles.
Ganzfeld goggles? What are those? They sound a bit intimidating.
They're actually pretty simple. You take 2 ping pong balls, cut them in half, and wear them over your eyes. Sounds strange.
I know, but the idea is to create a completely white visual field.
So it's like sensory deprivation for your eyes. Why would they do that?
It induces a trance-like state, which helps you relax and become more receptive to suggestions. The Soviets believed this sensory reduction helped quiet the mind and prepare it for the mental training that follows.
Okay, so you've got your Ganzfeld goggles on, you're relaxed, you're receptive. What happens next?
Next comes a series of attention control exercises, building on the techniques we talked about earlier. Remember those exercises involving switching attention between 2 radios or reading while listening to the news.
Those sounded challenging enough. How does ACT take it up a notch? ACT involves longer periods of focused attention, training your mind to maintain concentration for longer durations. Think of it like building mental stamina. And these exercises get progressively more challenging, increasing in duration and complexity.
So you're basically training your mind to be like a marathon runner, able to stay focused for the long haul.
Exactly. The Soviets believed mastering these attention control exercises was crucial for achieving SOF. It was the foundation for self-control and directing your mental energy where you wanted to go.
Okay, so you've got your mind focused, your attention honed. What's next in this ACT program?
The next stage is a technique called directing physiological changes. This is where you use mental commands to influence your body's responses.
Wait, are you saying you can control your body with your mind?
That's the idea. It's based on the principle conditioning. Remember the example of pairing the word on with the sensation of warmth in your hands.
Right.
Squeeze your right index finger.
Yeah.
Imagine hands getting warmer and warmer.
Right, but how does that actually work? Is there some scientific basis for this?
By repeatedly pairing a specific word or action with a physical sensation, you create a conditioned response. Your body starts to associate the two. Eventually, it starts responding automatically to the mental command. It's like creating a shortcut in your nervous system.
That's fascinating. So what kind of things could you control with this technique?
The Soviets used this to help athletes regulate their heart rate, muscle tension, even their perception of pain. They believe we have much more control over our physiological processes than we realize.
That's pretty mind-blowing. So you're training your mind to control your body. What happens after that in the ACT program?
Next comes achieving the auto-conditioning state, or ACS. It's a state of deep relaxation and mental stillness, similar to what you might experience in deep meditation.
I can see how those Ganzfeld goggles might help induce that state by reducing sensory input.
Exactly. But ACS also involves using a series of mental commands specifically focused on relaxation. You systematically go through your body, relaxing each muscle group from your toes to your head.
It's like a full body scan of relaxation.
Yes, and the more you practice, the better you become at entering this state of deep relaxation at will.
And why was this state so important for the Soviets?
They believe that in this relaxed and receptive state, your subconscious mind is more open to suggestions. You can then use affirmations, visualizations, and other mental techniques to instill positive beliefs, enhance motivation, and even reprogram negative habits.
So it's almost like planting seeds in fertile soil. You're setting yourself up for success, but peak performance isn't all about relaxation, right? Sometimes you need to be energized and fired up. How did they address that?
You're right, and that's where the next stage comes in, activation.
How do you go from deep relaxation to being fully energized and ready for action?
It involves a different set of mental commands, this time focused on stimulating your sympathetic nervous system, the part responsible for the fight or flight response. You're essentially triggering your body's natural adrenaline rush.
So you're using your mind to trigger a physical response.
Right, you use mental imagery and self-talk to create sensations of coolness, lightness, energy, and focus. Imagine a surge of power flowing through your body, or visualize yourself performing at your peak.
It sounds like a powerful combination of physical and mental techniques. Did you use any physical techniques to enhance this activation process?
One technique they used was the contrast shower.
Okay.
It involves alternating between hot and cold water, which stimulates blood flow and invigorates the body.
It sounds intense.
It can be, but it's effective in getting you energized and ready to go. So you've gone from deep relaxation to energized activation. What comes next?
This is where it gets really interesting. What are the final steps in this ACT program?
The final stages focus on techniques for enhancing self-control, modifying personality traits, and tapping into your full potential. Remember the self-contract technique, where you make a commitment to yourself and put your pride on the line if you don't follow through.
Yes, it was all about holding yourself accountable.
ACT takes this concept further by setting a series of increasingly challenging self-contracts. The tasks get harder and more complex as you go building mental toughness and your ability to overcome resistance. You're essentially training your supron to be more disciplined and effective.
It sounds like a powerful way to build willpower, but what about those negative personality traits that can hold us back? How did they deal with those?
They had specific techniques for modifying undesirable traits. Remember Sergei the runner who struggled with anger? He would smash things when he got upset.
Yes, his sports psychologist actually helped him rechannel his anger into competitive drive. He transformed that destructive energy into a source of power.
Exactly. ACT provides a framework for identifying your strengths and weaknesses and then amplifying the positive and mitigating the negative. It's about understanding all aspects of yourself and using them to your advantage.
So it's not about denying those negative aspects. It's about learning to control them and use them constructively.
That's the idea. And it all culminates in this concept of identifying with your winning self. The final stage involves a powerful visualization where you create a mental image of your ideal self, embodying all the qualities and attributes you want to develop.
It sounds like you're essentially reprogramming your self-image. You're visualizing the person you want to become and then working towards making that vision a reality.
Precisely, they believe that by repeatedly visualizing and embodying this winning self, you would gradually align your thoughts, beliefs, and actions with this new identity. It's like creating a self-fulfilling prophecy.
This ACT program really is a comprehensive system for personal transformation, but it also sounds incredibly demanding. Do you have to be an Olympic athlete to benefit from it?
Absolutely not. While it was originally developed for elite athletes, the principles and techniques of ACT can be applied to any area of life where you're striving for excellence.
So what does all of this mean for our listeners who are interested in unlocking their own peak performance?
It means that peak performance isn't just about natural talent or luck. It's a skill that can be cultivated through consistent effort, deliberate practice, and a willingness to push beyond your comfort zone. The Soviets believed that we all have incredible untapped potential, and ACT offers a roadmap for accessing that potential and transforming yourself into the best version of yourself.
This has been a fascinating deep dive into the Soviet system for cultivating peak performance. We've explored everything from overcoming resistance to change and embracing pain, to mastering consciousness and attention, developing self-control, and achieving a state of optimal functioning. We even got into the practical steps of their auto-conditioning training program, a comprehensive system for personal transformation. But the real journey starts now. What will you take away from this deep dive? Which principles resonated with you? Which techniques are you excited to try? And what does this Soviet system reveal about the potential that lies within us? All, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep seeking, keep learning, and keep pushing towards your own peak performance.